The neon glow of Miami's nightlife pulsed through the air, the sound of bass-heavy music spilling out of bars and clubs along Ocean Drive. Inside E11 Even, one of the city's most exclusive strip clubs, the scent of expensive cologne, cigar smoke and top-shelf liquor mingled in the air. The VIP section was alive with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hushed conversations of men who had everything: money, power, and the arrogance that came with both. Among them was Daniel Reynolds, a self-made millionaire whose name was etched into the skyline of Miami through his chain of high-end real estate developments. He leaned back on the plush leather couch, a glass of Macallan 25 in hand, watching the performers on stage with the casual detachment of a man used to luxury. His friends were deep in conversation, discussing everything from stock market trends to the latest scandals in the business world. But Daniel wasn't paying attention. He was here to unwind, to escape the suffocating boardroom meetings, the endless calls, and the responsibilities that came with his empire. This was his time to forget, even if just for a few hours. A brunette with curves in all the right places sauntered over, placing a hand on his shoulder as she whispered something provocative in his ear. He smirked, slipping a crisp $100 bill into her garter before she strutted off to another table. The night was unfolding as expected, until his gaze drifted toward the main stage. The club's lighting shifted to a deep shade of red, and the DJ's voice echoed through the speakers, introducing the next performer. "Gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to Lana." The moment she stepped onto the stage, Daniel felt his stomach drop. For a second he thought he was imagining it. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the dim lighting playing tricks on him. But as she moved under the spotlight, there was no denying it. It was her. Olivia. His ex-wife. His grip on the glass tightened, his pulse hammering in his ears. It had been nearly 6 years since he had last seen her. The divorce had been ugly, bitter, and final. She had left without a trace, cutting all ties, disappearing from his world as if she had never existed. And now, here she was, moving on stage with the same grace he remembered, yet something about her was different. She wasn't the woman he once knew, the one who had spent evenings cooking dinner for them, who had laughed at his bad jokes, who had once believed in forever. This Olivia was hardened, her expression unreadable, her movements practiced and deliberate. Daniel barely heard the laughter around him, barely noticed his friend nudging him. "Damn, she's something else, huh?" Someone muttered. He didn't respond. His throat was dry, his mind reeling. What the hell was she doing here? He watched as she moved through her routine, her eyes scanning the crowd but never really seeing anyone. Then for a brief moment their eyes met. And just like that, time stopped. Her breath hitched, her step faltered ever so slightly, small enough that no one else would notice but Daniel did. Recognition flashed across her face, followed by something else. Panic. Then, just as quickly as it came, she masked it, continuing her routine as if he weren't sitting there, as if he weren't a ghost from her past invading her present. Daniel didn't move for the next 5 minutes. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together how the woman he once loved, the woman he had searched for after she left, had ended up here. The moment the performance ended, Olivia disappeared behind the curtain, and without a second thought, Daniel rose to his feet. Ignoring the questioning looks from his friends, he moved toward the hallway leading to the performers' dressing rooms. A security guard stepped forward, blocking his path. "VIPs stay in the lounge, sir." Daniel exhaled sharply, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a $500 bill and held it up. "I just need 5 minutes." The guard hesitated, eyeing him for a moment before taking the cash and stepping aside. Daniel walked past him, his heart pounding as he reached the dressing room area. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the sight that greeted him hit harder than he could have prepared for. Olivia was sitting on a worn-out couch, her back to him, her long hair cascading down her bare shoulders. But it wasn't just her. Next to her, curled up on the seat, was a small boy, fast asleep, his tiny arms wrapped around a stuffed rabbit. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. His entire world tilted on its axis. His voice, when he finally found it, was hoarse. "Olivia?" She stiffened, her entire body going rigid before she slowly turned to face him. Her eyes, those same hazel eyes he used to get lost in, were filled with fear, defiance, and something else he couldn't quite name. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, thick with 6 years of unanswered questions. Finally, Olivia broke it. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel." His gaze flickered to the child. He looked around for maybe 5 years old. His chest tightened. The math didn't lie. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Is he?" Olivia's jaw clenched, her expression unreadable. but she didn't answer. And in that silence Daniel knew. The child was his. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel felt as if the ground beneath him had vanished. His gaze remained locked on the boy, his mind racing through a million thoughts, yet none of them made sense. His heart pounded so loudly that he barely registered Olivia standing up, stepping in front of the child as if to shield him. Her body was tense, her face unreadable, but her eyes told him everything. She had never planned for this moment to happen. She had never wanted him to know. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself at a loss for words. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. His entire life had been built on control, controlling his business, controlling his public image, controlling every move he made. But standing here, seeing the boy that looked so much like him, he realized he had no control over this. His hands clenched at his sides, his voice barely above a whisper. "Olivia, tell me the truth." She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples as if trying to will away the inevitable conversation. "You shouldn't be here, Daniel," she said again, her voice low but firm. She turned to glance at the sleeping child before looking back at him, her expression guarded. "Just leave. Pretend you didn't see us." Daniel let out a hollow laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Are you kidding me? You think I can just walk away after this? After seeing him?" His voice was rising now, disbelief laced with frustration. "You disappeared, Olivia. No contact, no explanation. I searched for you. And now, after all these years, I find you here, with my son?" She flinched, and for the first time her composure cracked. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, glancing at the boy. Daniel immediately regretted raising his tone, but the anger boiling inside him refused to settle. He took a step closer, lowering his voice but making sure she heard every word. "Why didn't you tell me?" Olivia swallowed hard, crossing her arms over her chest. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," she muttered, shaking her head. "You were too busy building your empire. Too busy with your next deal, your next investment, your next late-night meeting." Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. "When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I couldn't raise him in your world. A world where money comes before family. A world where love is just another business transaction." Daniel felt like she had slapped him. He opened his mouth to argue, but deep down he knew she wasn't completely wrong. Back then he had been obsessed with success. He had spent more nights in the office than at home. But that didn't mean he wouldn't have stepped up. That didn't mean he didn't deserve to know. "You don't get to make that decision for me," he said through gritted teeth. "I had a right to be there. To raise him. To know him." Olivia's eyes shimmered with something dangerously close to regret, but she didn't back down. "And what would you have done, Daniel? Hired a nanny? Sent him off to some elite boarding school while you focused on work?" She shook her head. "I wasn't going to let him grow up feeling like he was second place. I did what I thought was best." Daniel let out a sharp breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. His emotions were all over the place: anger, betrayal, shock. But beneath it all was something deeper: guilt. Because even though he hated to admit it, there was a part of him that wondered if Olivia had been right. Would he have been a good father back then? Or would he have been too caught up in his ambition to notice the little things that mattered? His eyes flickered back to the boy, still curled up on the couch, his chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. He had missed so much. His first steps, his first words, his first birthday. He had been a father for nearly 5 years and he hadn't even known. The thought made his stomach twist. He swallowed hard and looked back at Olivia. "What's his name?" His voice was softer now, raw with emotion. She hesitated, then sighed. "Ethan." "Ethan." Daniel let the name settle in his mind, committing it to memory. His son. His little boy. He took a shaky breath, trying to process it all. Does he know about me?" Olivia hesitated before shaking her head. "No," she admitted. "I never told him." Daniel felt something inside him break. He had been erased from his own child's life. He had gone from being an absent father by circumstance to an absent father by choice. Not his choice, but Olivia's. He stared at her, the weight of her decision crushing him. "That's not fair," he whispered. "That's not fair to me. And it's not fair to him." Olivia closed her eyes for a moment before looking at him again, her expression pained. "I know," she said quietly. "But I can't change the past, Daniel. All I can do is protect him now." Daniel let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. He had come here expecting a night of escape, a night of indulgence. Instead, he had found the one thing he never thought he'd have: a son. And now that he knew, there was no way in hell he was walking away. He wasn't going to be just a name on a birth certificate or a forgotten ghost in the background of Ethan's life. He straightened, his eyes locking onto Olivia's with a quiet determination. "I want to be in his life," he said firmly. "I don't care what it takes. I don't care how hard it is. But I am his father, and I will not let him grow up without knowing who I am." Olivia's lips parted slightly as if she wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. She studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint that he would walk away once the shock wore off. When she didn't find it, she sighed, rubbing her temples. "This isn't just about you, Daniel. It's about him. His safety. His stability." "I know," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I want to do this right. I don't want to fight you, Olivia. But I'm not going to disappear. I've already missed too much." She sighed again, looking away for a long moment before finally nodding. "We'll talk," she murmured. "But not here. Not now." Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A door had been cracked open, and he was going to do whatever it took to step through it. His eyes drifted back to Ethan, his heart tightening at the sight of him. He had a son. And no matter what happened next, one thing was certain: he wasn't going to lose him again. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel barely slept that night. After leaving the club, he had driven aimlessly through the streets of Miami, the city lights blurring past as his mind raced. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face, the small, peaceful rise and fall of his chest as he slept, the soft curls in his hair, the way his tiny hands clutched the stuffed rabbit. His son. A child he hadn't even known existed until a few hours ago. A child who had been growing up without him while he sat in his high-rise office, signing multi-million-dollar deals and thinking he had everything. Now he realized he had been missing the one thing that mattered the most. The thought gnawed at him, a deep, painful regret settling in his chest. He had always prided himself on being in control, yet somehow his entire life had unraveled in a single night. By the time the sun began to rise, he had made a decision. He wasn't going to be a stranger in Ethan's life. No matter what it took, he would be there for his son. And that meant facing Olivia again, this time with a clear head and a plan. He knew she wouldn't make this easy for him, and he didn't blame her. She had raised Ethan alone, protected him, made choices she thought were best. But now that Daniel knew the truth, he wasn't going to be pushed aside. That morning he called his assistant and cleared his schedule for the week. His company, his meetings, his clients, none of it mattered right now. The only thing that did was fixing the mess his absence had created. Then, without thinking twice, he drove straight to the small apartment complex Olivia had given him the address to. It wasn't in the part of Miami he was used to. There were no luxury cars lining the streets, no high-end boutiques or expensive restaurants. Instead, there were modest buildings, kids riding bikes on the sidewalk, families heading out for their morning routines. It was a life far removed from the one Daniel had built for himself, and yet, as he stepped out of his car, it was the first time in years that he felt something real. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on her door. He heard footsteps, then a pause as if she was debating whether or not to open it. A moment later, the door creaked open just enough for Olivia to look at him, her expression unreadable. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept either. He didn't know if that made him feel better or worse. "Daniel," she said, her voice guarded. "You're early." "I couldn't wait," he admitted, trying to keep his tone steady. "I need to see him." She studied him for a long moment before finally sighing and stepping aside. "Come in," she said, though there was no warmth in her voice. He walked in, taking in the small but cozy apartment. It was nothing like the penthouses he was used to, but it was comfortable, lived in. Toys were scattered near the couch, a few crayon drawings pinned to the fridge. His heart clenched at the sight. This was his son's world, and he had never been a part of it. Then he saw him. Ethan was sitting on the floor in the living room, still in his pajamas, playing with a set of building blocks. He looked up at Daniel with wide, curious eyes but didn't say anything. He didn't know who he was. The realization nearly broke him. He had spent his life making powerful men respect him with just a look, but right now, standing in front of a 4-year-old who didn't know he was his father, he had never felt smaller. Olivia walked over to Ethan and crouched beside him. "Sweetheart, this is Daniel. He's a friend." The words stung, but Daniel understood why she had said them. She wasn't going to drop something like this on a child without easing into it. Still, it hurt. Ethan studied him for a moment, then in a quiet voice said, "Hi." Daniel forced a smile, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "Hey, buddy." He hesitated before glancing at the blocks. "You're building something cool there." Ethan looked down at his creation. It's a castle, he said, picking up another block and adding it to the top. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening. It's a really good castle. They sat like that for a while, Daniel watching as Ethan built, occasionally asking him questions, letting him talk. Olivia stood nearby, arms crossed, watching everything. She was waiting for him to mess up, to say the wrong thing, to prove that he didn't belong here. But Daniel wasn't going to fail this time. He had already failed once by not being there from the start. After a while, Ethan suddenly looked up at him and asked, "Do you like castles?" Daniel smiled genuinely this time. "I do. I used to build them all the time when I was your age." Ethan's eyes brightened. "Really? Really?" Daniel nodded. "Maybe we can build one together sometime." The little boy thought about it for a second, then gave a small nod. "Okay." It was just one word, but to Daniel it was everything. Olivia, however, wasn't as easily swayed. When Ethan got distracted with his toys again, she motioned for Daniel to follow her into the kitchen. The moment they were alone, she turned to him with a hard expression. "You can't just show up like this and think everything is fine," she said in a low voice. "This isn't going to be easy, Daniel." "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm not going anywhere." He met her gaze, determination in his eyes. "I want to be in his life, Olivia. And not just for a visit. I want to be his father." She inhaled sharply, glancing toward the living room, where Ethan was still playing, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing between his parents. "Then prove it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Prove to me that this isn't just some sudden burst of guilt. Prove to me that you're not going to walk away when things get hard." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I will," he said firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "We take this slow," she finally said. "He doesn't know who you are yet, and I'm not just dropping that on him overnight. If you want to be here, you do it on my terms." Daniel nodded. "Whatever it takes," he repeated. She shook her head as if she still didn't quite believe him, but something in her expression softened just the slightest bit. "We'll see." Daniel exhaled, glancing back at the little boy who had unknowingly changed his entire world. This was just the beginning. He had no idea what the road ahead looked like, but one thing was certain: he wasn't walking away. Not this time. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel found himself waking up earlier than usual the next morning, the reality of his newfound fatherhood settling into his bones. Sleep had been nearly impossible. Every time he closed his eyes he thought about Ethan, his small hands gripping the toy blocks, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about castles, the innocence in his voice when he asked if Daniel liked them too. It was surreal, overwhelming, but most of all it was terrifying. He had spent years building an empire, sealing million-dollar deals without hesitation, standing in rooms filled with ruthless businessmen who could destroy careers with a single word. But none of that had prepared him for the weight of this moment, becoming a father to a child who didn't even know who he truly was. He didn't want to waste time. He had already lost too much of Ethan's life, and if he had any chance of making things right, he needed to act now. He grabbed his phone and dialed Olivia's number. The call rang twice before she answered, her voice groggy. "Daniel, it's 7 in the morning." "I know," he said quickly, pacing the floor of his penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Miami skyline, but for the first time in years, the view didn't hold his interest. "I want to see him today." There was a pause. He could hear her shifting, probably sitting up in bed. "Daniel, we agreed to take this slow." "I get that," he said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "But I can't just sit around and pretend like nothing has changed. I want to be in his life, Olivia. And that means spending time with him." She sighed, and he could tell she was debating whether or not to argue. Finally she spoke. "Fine. But we do it my way." Daniel exhaled, relieved. "Whatever it takes." A few hours later he pulled up outside a small park in Coconut Grove, a quiet neighborhood far removed from the flashy high-end world he was used to. He spotted Olivia sitting on a bench near the playground, Ethan beside her, his tiny legs swinging as he nibbled on a granola bar. For a moment Daniel just stood there watching them. This was their routine, mother and son, sharing a quiet morning together before the rest of the world intruded. And for the first time he was a part of it. Ethan noticed him first. His little face scrunched up in curiosity as he turned to Olivia. "Mommy, the castle guy is here." Olivia stifled a smile, looking up at Daniel as he approached. "Yeah, he is." Daniel crouched down to Ethan's level, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, buddy." Ethan studied him for a second before nodding. "Hi." Then, as if he had already accepted Daniel's presence, he turned back to his granola bar, completely unbothered. Daniel chuckled, glancing at Olivia. Well, that's a good sign. She smirked, crossing her arms. Don't take it personally. He's like that with new people. Daniel's chest tightened at those words. He didn't want to be just a new person in Ethan's life. He wanted to be his father. But he knew he couldn't rush this. Olivia was watching him carefully, waiting to see if he would lose patience, if he would walk away when things didn't go his way. He had to prove her wrong. So, he said, shifting his attention back to Ethan, what's the plan for today? Ethan looked at his mom, then at Daniel. We usually go to the swings. Daniel nodded. Swings sound fun. Can I push you? The little boy seemed to consider it, then nodded again. Okay. Daniel couldn't explain why that small word filled his chest with warmth, but it did. He followed Ethan to the swings, helping him climb onto one before giving him a gentle push. The sound of his laughter as he soared through the air was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard. It was pure, unfiltered joy. And for the first time in his life, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Money, success, power, none of it compared to this moment. This was real. He lost track of time, caught up in the simplicity of playing with Ethan. They raced across the grass, built tiny forts out of sticks, and even had a small pretend sword fight with tree branches. Olivia stood nearby, watching them, her arms crossed as if trying to maintain her distance, but there was something different in her expression. She wasn't as guarded as before. As the sun started to dip lower, Olivia called Ethan over. Time to head home, kiddo. Ethan pouted. But I want to play more. Olivia gave him a pointed look. It's getting late. Ethan sighed dramatically before turning to Daniel. Are you coming too? Daniel froze. The question hit him harder than he expected. He glanced at Olivia, waiting for her reaction. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. Daniel has work, sweetheart. Daniel saw the disappointment in Ethan's eyes and immediately shook his head. Actually, I don't have work today. He looked at Olivia, his gaze steady. If it's okay, I'd like to come. Olivia studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. Fine. But no surprises. Ethan cheered, grabbing Daniel's hand as they headed toward the car. The warmth of his small fingers in Daniel's palm sent an unfamiliar emotion rushing through him, something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. The ride to Olivia's apartment was quiet, Ethan humming a song in the back seat while Daniel stole occasional glances at Olivia. He could tell she was still hesitant, still waiting for him to slip up. He knew he had a long way to go before she fully trusted him, but at least she was giving him a chance. That was more than he could have asked for. When they arrived, Ethan ran inside excitedly, immediately grabbing his toy cars and setting them up on the floor. Daniel stood near the doorway, unsure of what to do next. Olivia sighed, motioning toward the couch. You can stay for dinner if you want. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Are you inviting me or just tolerating me? She smirked, rolling her eyes. Don't push your luck. He chuckled, but deep down he knew this was progress. Sitting down on the couch, he watched as Ethan played, his little world filled with nothing but imagination and joy. And for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't feel the need to check his phone, answer emails, or think about his next business move. He was exactly where he needed to be. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel had never been nervous about anything in his life. He had built his company from the ground up, sat across from some of the most ruthless business moguls in the country, and made decisions worth millions in mere seconds. But sitting in Olivia's small apartment, watching Ethan push his toy cars across the floor while Olivia moved around the kitchen, he felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. He had no idea how to do this, how to fit into their lives without disrupting everything Olivia had built for herself and their son. Yet, for the first time in years, he was willing to try no matter how difficult it was. Dinner was simple, pasta and garlic bread. It wasn't the kind of meal Daniel was used to, the type prepared by private chefs in his penthouse, but it felt real. Olivia placed a plate in front of Ethan, then sat across from Daniel at the small dining table, her eyes studying him cautiously. It was strange, sitting here like a family when they had spent years apart. Daniel noticed how Olivia still had the habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought, how she absent-mindedly cut Ethan's food into smaller bites even though he was perfectly capable of doing it himself. These small things, the details he had missed out on, made his chest ache with regret. Ethan, oblivious to the tension between his parents, happily ate his food, kicking his legs beneath the table. "Mommy, can Daniel come tomorrow too?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent excitement. Olivia glanced at Daniel, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, Daniel is busy with work," she said carefully. Daniel saw the flicker of disappointment in his son's eyes, and before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Actually, I can make time," he said, meeting Olivia's gaze. "If it's okay with your mom, I'd love to come." Olivia let out a quiet sigh, putting down her fork. "Daniel?" She hesitated, her voice softer this time. "You can't just show up every day and expect everything to fall into place." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low enough so Ethan wouldn't catch the weight of the conversation. "I'm not expecting that. I just want to be here for him." She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine. But you need to be consistent. If you say you'll come, you show up." Daniel felt the weight of her words. He wasn't just making a casual promise, he was making a commitment. "I will," he said firmly. After dinner, Olivia started cleaning up while Ethan ran back to his toys. Daniel instinctively grabbed the dishes, but Olivia raised an eyebrow at him. "What are you doing?" He smirked. "Helping." She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Never thought I'd see the day." Daniel rinsed the plates, the act oddly therapeutic. He was used to high-stakes meetings, endless conference calls, but this, washing dishes in a small kitchen while his son played in the next room, felt more meaningful than anything he had done in years. Once they were done, Olivia went to get Ethan ready for bed. Daniel lingered in the living room, unsure if he should stay or leave. A few minutes later, Ethan came running back in, his hair damp from his bath, wearing pajamas covered in cartoon dinosaurs. "Mommy reads me a story before bed," he announced, holding up a worn-out book. Daniel crouched down. "That sounds like a good tradition." Ethan hesitated for a moment, then did something Daniel hadn't expected. He handed him the book. "You read." Olivia froze in the doorway, clearly as surprised as Daniel. The air felt thick with emotion. Daniel took the book carefully as if it were something fragile, then followed Ethan into his small bedroom. The bed was covered in superhero sheets, stuffed animals scattered across the pillows. Daniel sat beside him, flipping to the first page, his voice steady as he read aloud. He felt Olivia watching from the doorway, but he didn't look up. This moment wasn't about her, it was about Ethan. Halfway through the story, Ethan's blinks became slower, his little body curling up under the blanket. By the time Daniel reached the last page, he was asleep, his tiny fingers still clutching the corner of the book. Daniel exhaled, closing it gently before placing it on the nightstand. He sat there for a moment just watching his son, sleep peacefully. He had missed so much, his first steps, his first words, his first everything. But he refused to miss any more. As he stood up, he turned to see Olivia leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. She didn't say anything, just motioned for him to follow her back into the living room. When they were alone, she let out a breath. "He likes you," she admitted. Daniel met her gaze. "I want him to know me." Olivia's expression softened for the first time. "I know. That's what scares me." He frowned. "Why?" She hesitated before speaking. "Because I can't protect him from you if you decide this isn't what you want." He's for Daniel. He doesn't understand complicated emotions or broken promises. If you disappear, it'll hurt him more than it'll ever hurt me. Daniel felt like someone had punched him in the gut. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see." He wanted to argue, to tell her he was serious, but he knew words wouldn't be enough. Only actions would prove it. As he walked to the door, he paused, looking back one last time. "Good night, Olivia." She gave him a small nod. "Good night, Daniel." As he stepped into the cool Miami night, a realization settled deep in his chest. This wasn't just about showing up. This was about proving, every single day, that he deserved to be a father to Ethan. And he would do whatever it took. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel woke up the next morning with an unfamiliar feeling. A sense of purpose that had nothing to do with business meetings or financial deals. It wasn't about the stock market, negotiations, or profit margins. It was about a little boy who had fallen asleep clutching a book, a child who had looked up at him with trust, completely unaware of the mistakes Daniel had made in the past. That thought alone kept him restless, and by 7 a.m., he was already dressed, his coffee untouched as he stared out over the Miami skyline. His phone buzzed on the counter and he grabbed it immediately, hoping it was Olivia. Instead, it was Carter, his right-hand man at the company, probably wondering why Daniel had missed their usual early morning call. He let it go to voicemail. For the first time in years, work wasn't his priority. By the time he arrived at Olivia's apartment, he felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. He had told Ethan he'd come and he refused to break that promise. When Olivia opened the door, she looked surprised as if she hadn't fully expected him to follow through. She glanced at the clock. "You're early." Daniel gave a small shrug. "Figured I'd make up for lost time." She sighed but stepped aside, letting him in. Ethan was sitting on the floor, still in his pajamas, building what looked like an elaborate structure with his blocks. When he saw Daniel, his face lit up. "You came." Something warm spread in Daniel's chest. "Told you I would." Ethan grinned, then gestured to his creation. "I'm making a castle. But it needs a bridge." Daniel crouched down beside him, studying the structure as if it were one of his real estate developments. A bridge, huh? I think we can figure that out." Olivia watched from the kitchen, leaning against the counter. Daniel could feel her gaze, could sense the conflict in her. She was still wary, still unsure if he was here for the long run. He didn't blame her. He had walked away once before, leaving her to raise Ethan alone. No matter how much he wanted to rewrite the past, he couldn't. The only thing he could do was show her, every day, that he wasn't the same man anymore. They spent the next hour playing, and Daniel was surprised by how easily he got lost in it. The empire he had built, the millions he had made, none of it compared to the simple joy of hearing Ethan laugh as they worked together. He never thought he'd enjoy something as mundane as stacking blocks, but in that moment nothing else mattered. Eventually, Olivia told Ethan to go change, and as soon as he ran off, she turned to Daniel. "He's happy," she said, her voice softer than before. Daniel nodded. "That's all I want." She hesitated before speaking again. "I meant what I said last night. If you're going to be here, you have to be consistent." "I know. And," she crossed her arms, looking uncertain, "you should know that I'm not expecting anything from you financially. I never have." Daniel frowned. "Olivia, that's not." She shook her head. "I mean it. I don't want you thinking you can buy your way into his life. I wouldn't do that." His voice was firm. "This isn't about money. It's about him. About making up for the years I lost." She studied him for a moment, then finally nodded as if she was starting to believe him, just a little. "Okay." Ethan came running back in, now fully dressed, and grabbed Daniel's hand. "Can we go to the park?" Daniel glanced at Olivia, silently asking for permission. She sighed but smiled. "Fine. But be back by lunch." Ethan cheered, dragging Daniel toward the door, and for the first time, Daniel felt like he truly belonged in his son's life. The park was lively, filled with other children running around, parents watching from benches or chatting amongst themselves. Daniel couldn't remember the last time he had been in a place like this. Somewhere normal, somewhere where people weren't discussing business deals over overpriced cocktails. Ethan ran straight to the swings, turning back expectantly. "Push me?" Daniel chuckled. "Of course." As he pushed Ethan higher and higher, listening to his laughter ring through the air, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent years chasing success, believing that his wealth and power defined him. But standing here, watching his son's happiness, he realized that none of it mattered as much as this. This was real. After the park, they stopped by a small cafe for hot chocolate. Daniel watched as Ethan dunked his cookie into the drink, completely absorbed in the moment. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Ethan asked suddenly, licking chocolate from his fingers. Daniel smiled. "I do. But I think you like them more." Ethan nodded eagerly. "Yeah. Mom says I know more about them than most grown-ups." Daniel chuckled. "I believe that." For a while they just talked, about dinosaurs, superheroes, and the moon. Ethan's world was simple, filled with wonder, and Daniel found himself drawn into it more than he ever thought possible. He wasn't used to this kind of connection, to conversations that weren't driven by business or strategy. It was refreshing. It was everything he didn't know he needed. By the time they got back to Olivia's apartment, Ethan was dozing off in the back seat. Daniel carefully lifted him, carrying him inside. Olivia looked surprised but said nothing as she opened the door. Daniel laid Ethan on the couch, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead before stepping back. "You're good with him," Olivia said quietly once Ethan was settled. Daniel turned to her. "I want to be." She sighed, crossing her arms. "You're different." "I had to be." He met her gaze. "Walking away from you, from him, was the biggest mistake of my life. I can't change that, but I can be better now." She nodded slowly as if she wanted to believe him but wasn't ready to fully trust it yet. "We'll see." Daniel knew it would take time. But for once he was willing to be patient. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel sat in his office at the top of the high-rise, staring out at the Miami skyline, but his mind was far from business. The usual noise of ringing phones, the chatter of his employees, and the constant emails demanding his attention all seemed distant. Ever since he re-entered Ethan's life, everything that once seemed important now felt secondary. He had spent years chasing success, building his empire, believing that his legacy would be his wealth and power. But now he realized that the real legacy he wanted was one built on something much more personal: his role as a father. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door before Carter, his longtime business partner and closest confidant, stepped in. Carter had been with him since the beginning, back when they were just two ambitious young men trying to make a name for themselves. Unlike Daniel, Carter had settled down years ago, married with 2 kids, and he always made it clear that family came before anything. "You've been off your game lately," Carter said, dropping into the chair across from Daniel's desk. "I mean, don't get me wrong, the company's still running smoothly, but you're different. You're not the guy who used to pull all-nighters, obsess over every detail, and chase every deal like it was life or death." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. Maybe that guy was chasing the wrong things. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Olivia?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Ethan." Carter leaned back, nodding slowly. Makes sense now. "I've been spending time with him," Daniel admitted. "And it's different, Carter. I never thought I'd care about something outside of this office, but every time I'm with him, nothing else matters. It's like I've been blind for years, and suddenly I can see what's really important." Carter smirked. "Took you long enough." Daniel gave him a look. "You don't think it's too late?" Carter shook his head. "Not if you're serious about being there. Look, man, I've known you a long time. You've built this company from the ground up, made sacrifices, fought harder than anyone else I know. But this? Being a father? This is the one thing that actually matters. The boardroom will always be here. Ethan won't always be 4 years old." Daniel exhaled, knowing Carter was right. "I just don't know if Olivia will ever fully trust me." "She will," Carter said. "But only if you prove to her that you're here for the long run. Words won't mean much to her. Actions will." Daniel nodded, his decision made. He wasn't just going to be there for Ethan occasionally, he was going to be there always. That evening he showed up at Olivia's apartment again, unannounced but not unwelcome. She opened the door, surprised to see him but not shutting him out. "Hey," she said, crossing her arms. "Did we have plans?" Daniel shook his head. "No, but I was hoping we could talk." Olivia studied him for a moment before stepping aside, letting him in. Ethan was already in his pajamas, sitting on the floor with his toys. When he saw Daniel, his face lit up. "You came again." Daniel smiled. "Told you I would." Ethan ran over, grabbing his hand. "Can you help me build my spaceship?" Daniel nodded. "Of course." As they sat on the floor together, assembling the toy, Olivia watched quietly from the kitchen. She had seen men make promises before, men who said they would be there but never followed through. But Daniel was starting to show something different: consistency. After an hour, when Ethan finally started yawning, Olivia gently nudged him toward bed. Daniel followed them into his small room, watching as Olivia tucked him in. Ethan reached for his book, then looked at Daniel. "Will you read tonight?" Daniel glanced at Olivia, who gave him a small nod. He took the book, sitting beside Ethan as he read, his voice calm and steady. By the time he finished, Ethan was asleep, his small hand resting against his chest. Daniel closed the book, setting it aside before standing up. In the living room, Olivia stood by the window, arms crossed. She didn't turn around as she spoke. "You keep showing up." Daniel walked over, standing beside her. "I told you I would." She sighed. "I want to believe you. But I also know what it feels like to count on someone and have them disappear." Daniel turned to her. "I'm not disappearing, Olivia." She finally met his gaze, her expression softer than before. "Then keep proving it." And for the first time in years, Daniel knew exactly what he needed to do. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Daniel had never been more certain about anything in his life. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions. Learning about Ethan, reconnecting with Olivia, and rediscovering a part of himself he had long buried beneath business deals and boardroom meetings. But now, standing outside Olivia's apartment once again, he knew this wasn't just a phase. This was his life. He knocked, and when Olivia opened the door, she looked tired but not annoyed to see him. "Hey," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan was sitting on the couch, watching cartoons, and the moment he saw Daniel he scrambled up with excitement. "You came again." Daniel smiled, ruffling his son's hair. Of course I did. How could I miss movie night? Ethan grabbed his hand, dragging him to the couch. Olivia sat beside them, and for a while they just watched the movie together, the three of them. Daniel didn't care that it was an animated film about talking animals, he cared that he was here, with them. As the movie ended and Ethan dozed off, Olivia carefully carried him to bed while Daniel cleaned up the popcorn. When she returned, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You know, I keep waiting for you to disappear, she admitted. Daniel put the empty bowl in the sink and turned to her. And I keep proving that I won't. She exhaled, looking down. It's hard to believe it's real. I get that, he said, stepping closer. I messed up before, Olivia. I walked away from you and from Ethan, and I'll never be able to change that. But I can change what happens next. I don't just want to be a visitor in his life. I want to be his father fully. She looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. And what does that mean? It means I'm done living in a penthouse alone when my son is growing up in a place I don't belong to yet. It means I don't want to be a weekend dad or an occasional visitor. I want to be there always. He swallowed hard before continuing. I don't just want to co-parent with you, Olivia. I want to be part of your lives again. Olivia's eyes softened, and for the first time she didn't look like she was bracing for disappointment. That's a big step. I know, he admitted. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that none of this, the money, the business, the success, means anything if I don't have you too. She studied him for a long time before finally speaking. Then show me. Daniel nodded, understanding that trust wasn't rebuilt in a single conversation. It was earned day by day. He reached for her hand, and to his relief she didn't pull away. I will. And for the first time Olivia actually believed him.